I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the certified letter taped to my front door with its crisp HOA letterhead staring back at me like an accusation. My name is Zachary Owens, and after 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I thought I'd finally found peace in this quiet corner of Prescott Valley, Arizona. I purchased my property 6 months ago, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on 2 acres at the edge of Sunset Ridge Estates. The real estate agent mentioned an HOA, but assured me it was inactive and basically dormant. That should have been my first clue to dig deeper. I tore open the envelope standing right there on my porch, the late afternoon sun beating down on my neck. The letter was from Margaret Norton, president of the Sunset Ridge HOA, informing me that I was in violation of no fewer than 8 community guidelines. My truck was too visible from the street. My lawn exceeded the allowable grass height by 2 inches. I had an unauthorized satellite dish. My mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. The list went on, each violation carrying a fine of $250, $2,000 in total fines for a house I'd owned for 6 months. I read the letter 3 times, my jaw tightening with each pass. The Army had taught me discipline, patience, and how to navigate bureaucracy, but it had also taught me not to roll over when someone tried to steamroll me with manufactured authority. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered on the second ring. Sunset Ridge HOA, Margaret Norton speaking. Mrs. Norton, this is Zachary Owens. I just received your letter about violations. Oh, Mr. Owens, yes. Her voice had that particular pitch I'd learned to recognize over the years, the kind that enjoyed wielding small amounts of power. I trust you'll remedy these issues promptly. Payment is due within 14 days. I'd like to discuss these violations. Some of them seem arbitrary. The CC and RS are quite clear, Mr. Owens. When you purchased your property, you agreed to abide by all community standards. I read the CC and RS. They were dated 1987 and mentioned nothing about satellite dishes or specific paint colors. There was a pause. We've updated our guidelines. Without a vote from homeowners? The board has the authority to make reasonable updates. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other calls to make. Good day, Mr. Owens. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there on my porch, the letter crumpling slightly in my grip. Then I did what any engineer would do. I went inside, fired up my laptop, and started pulling records. Property deeds, utility easements, historical documents, the original HOA charter, everything I could find in the county database, and my own files from the purchase. 3 hours later, I leaned back in my chair and stared at my screen in disbelief. My property wasn't just at the edge of Sunset Ridge Estates. According to the original 1985 plat maps and deeds, my 2 acres had been the original ranch land that the developer, a man named Harold Peterson, had subdivided to create the neighborhood. Peterson had kept my parcel for himself, building his retirement home here in 1986. The subdivision had 63 other lots, all carved from what had been Peterson's original 20-acre ranch. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was what ran through my property. When I'd walked the land before purchasing, I'd noticed the small utility building near my back fence, mostly hidden by cottonwood trees. I'd assumed it was an old pump house or storage shed. According to the documents I was now reading, that building housed the main water distribution junction for the entire neighborhood. Every drop of water that fed into Sunset Ridge Estates came from the municipal line that crossed my property, through that junction box, and then out to the neighborhood. I kept digging. The electrical transformer that stepped down power from the main lines, also on my property, tucked behind the same stand of trees. The natural gas line? It entered the subdivision through an easement that crossed the southwest corner of my land. Even the fiber optic cables that had been installed 5 years ago ran through a conduit that passed within 15 feet of my back deck. I sat back and processed this information. When Peterson subdivided his land, he had granted utility easements to service the new homes, standard procedure. But those easements all crossed his retained parcel, my current property. The utilities had right of access for maintenance, but the land itself and the infrastructure on it, that was different. I spent another hour reading through the technical details. The water junction wasn't city property. It had been built by Peterson himself when he developed the land. then connected to the municipal supply. Same with the electrical transformer, though the power company had installed that one at Peterson's request and expense. The gas line was similar. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Mr. Owens, this is Brenda from the HOA Compliance Committee." Another woman, this one with a nasal quality that suggested she'd perfected the art of complaining. "I'm calling to schedule an inspection of your property to document the violations Mrs. Norton identified." "When did the HOA start conducting inspections?" "We've always had the authority to ensure compliance." "I'll need to see that in writing. The original CC and RS don't mention property inspections." "Mr. Owens, if you're going to be difficult about this, we can simply refer the matter to our attorney and add legal fees to your fines." Something in me snapped. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the assumption that I'd just comply without question. Maybe it was 22 years of dealing with actual regulations and real authority figures, and now having to listen to someone who thought running an HOA made them a petty dictator. "Brenda, let me be very clear. No one is inspecting my property without my explicit written consent and a detailed legal justification. If Mrs. Norton wants to involve attorneys, she's welcome to do so. Have a good evening." I hung up. Then I made a call of my own to an old Army buddy, Marcus Chen, who'd retired a few years before me and now practiced real estate law in Phoenix. "Zach, how's civilian life treating you?" Marcus answered, his voice warm. "I've got an HOA problem." "Say no more. Every vet I know who's bought into an HOA has war stories. What's your situation?" I explained the fines, the violations, and the attitudes I'd encountered. Then I told him what I'd discovered about the utilities. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me that every major utility servicing this HOA runs through your property?" "Every single one. Water, power, gas, internet? And you've verified the infrastructure ownership?" "The water junction and electrical transformer were built and paid for by the original developer. They're not municipal property. They're private infrastructure connected to public utilities." "Zach, do you understand what you're sitting on?" "I'm starting to." "Don't do anything yet. Let me pull the relevant codes and regulations. This is potentially very interesting from a legal standpoint. How hostile is this HOA? They want $2,000 in fines for my grass being too tall." "That hostile? Got it. Give me 48 hours. In the meantime, document everything, every call, every letter, every interaction." We hung up, and I spent the rest of the evening photographing my property, measuring my grass, checking every supposed violation. My lawn was exactly 3 inches tall. The HOA guidelines I'd received at closing specified a maximum of 4 inches. My truck was parked in my driveway, which the guidelines explicitly permitted. The satellite dish was on my roof, installed professionally, barely visible from the street. Every single violation was either fabricated or based on rules that didn't exist in the original CC and RS. The next morning, I received another letter. This one informed me that due to my hostile and uncooperative attitude, the HOA board was imposing an additional $500 fine for conduct unbecoming a community member, and that my voting rights were suspended pending a hearing. I called Marcus. "They're escalating," I told him. "Perfect. Let them. Don't respond. Don't engage. Just document. I'm finding some very interesting case law. How attached are you to maintaining good relationships with your neighbors?" "I've barely met any of them. I keep to myself." "Good. Because what I'm about to propose is going to make you very unpopular with at least the HOA board. I've been unpopular with people who had actual guns pointed at me. I can handle some angry neighbors." Marcus laughed. "All right, here's what I've found. Those utilities cross your property via easements, which gives the utility companies right of access. But the infrastructure itself, the junction boxes, transformers, that's more complicated. You need to get the utility companies to clarify who owns what." "I'm on it." Over the next 2 days, I made calls and sent emails to every utility provider. The responses were illuminating. The water junction was indeed private infrastructure built by Peterson, maintained by the HOA through a service contract. The electrical transformer was owned by the power company, but sat on my private property via easement. The gas line was municipal, but the pressure regulator that served the neighborhood was privately owned, maintained by the HOA. Everything came back to the same point. While the utility companies had easements for access and maintenance, the actual distribution infrastructure was either mine by virtue of property ownership or belonged to the HOA, but sat on my land. Marcus called me on the third day. "I've drafted something. Can you come to Phoenix? I'll be there tomorrow." That evening, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find a woman in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing what looked like expensive athletic wear. Her face had that tight quality that suggested either stress or Botox, possibly both. "Mr. Owens, I'm Margaret Norton." "Mrs. Norton, what can I do for you?" "May I come in?" "I'd prefer to talk out here." Her smile was razor thin. "Very well. Mr. Owens, it seems we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I wanted to speak with you personally to resolve this situation before it becomes truly unpleasant." "I'm listening." "The HOA is prepared to reduce your fines to $1,000 if you remedy the violations immediately and agree to attend a community orientation session." "Mrs. Norton, I've reviewed the original CC and RS. The violations you've cited either don't exist in those documents or are based on rules that were never properly ratified by homeowner vote." Her expression hardened. "Mr. Owens, I don't think you understand how this works. The board has authority to maintain community standards. If you continue to resist, we can place a lien on your property. For violations that aren't actually violations. For violations that the board has determined are violations. Now, I've tried to be reasonable, but my patience has limits. You have 1 week to pay the fines and correct the issues, or we'll proceed with legal action." She turned and walked back to her white Mercedes SUV parked in my driveway. I watched her drive away, then went inside and added notes to my growing documentation file. The next morning, I drove to Phoenix. Marcus's office was in a sleek building near downtown, and he met me in the lobby with a grin. "You look like you're ready to go to war." "I'm ready to defend my property rights," I corrected. In his office, Marcus spread out documents across his conference table. "All right. Here's the situation. The HOA has overstepped significantly. The rules they're citing don't exist in the recorded CC and RS, which means they're not enforceable. You could fight this in court and win easily. But that's boring, and it doesn't address the larger issue of them continuing to harass you. So I've drafted something more creative." He slid a document across to me. "This is a formal notice to the HOA and all utility providers that you, as the property owner, are asserting your rights regarding the infrastructure on your land. You're not cutting off utilities. That would be illegal and cruel. But you're notifying everyone that the current arrangement is under review." What does that accomplish? It puts the HOA on notice that their behavior has consequences. Right now, they think they can bully you because they assume you're just another homeowner who doesn't know his rights. This tells them you're serious and informed. Will it work? It'll definitely get their attention, but Zach, you need to understand something. If you go down this road, it's going to get ugly. HOAs don't like being challenged, especially by someone who has actual leverage. I thought about Margaret Norton's threat, about Brenda's condescending tone, about $2,000 in fabricated fines. "Send it," Marcus nodded. "One more thing. I've also drafted a formal response to their violations notice, disputing each fine with specific references to the actual CC and rupees, and a demand for documentation of any rule changes, including proof of proper homeowner voting and notification." They won't have it. Exactly, which puts you in a very strong legal position. "But Zach, seriously, this is going to escalate. Are you sure? I'd spent 2 decades in the Army, including 3 deployments to places where people shot at me over things that actually mattered. An HOA board trying to extract bogus fines didn't even register on my threat assessment scale." "Send everything." The letters went out the next day via certified mail. I went back to Prescott Valley and waited. The response came faster than I expected. 4 days later, I received a call from a lawyer representing the HOA, a man named Richard Stevens. "Mr. Owens, I represent the Sunset Ridge HOA. I understand you've made some rather aggressive claims regarding utilities infrastructure. I've simply clarified the ownership and easement situation regarding my property." Mr. Owens, I don't think you want to go down this road. The HOA has every right to enforce community standards. Using rules that were never properly adopted? There was a pause. I'm not sure what you mean. Your client is attempting to enforce regulations that don't appear in the recorded CC and RS, and for which there's no documentation of homeowner approval. That's not enforcement, Mr. Stevens. That's extortion. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate description. I'm happy to discuss this further in court if your client wishes to proceed with their lien threat. Another pause. Perhaps we can find a reasonable solution. What if the HOA waives the fines in exchange for your cooperation with community standards going forward? What if the HOA follows its own governing documents and stops making up rules? Mr. Owens, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm asking the HOA to follow the law. If that's unreasonable, we have very different definitions of the word. The call ended shortly after. I'd dealt with enough lawyers in the military to recognize when one was on shaky ground. Stevens knew his clients had overreached, but Margaret Norton apparently didn't get the message. 2 days later, I came home to find a bright orange notice sticker on my front door declaring my property in violation of community standards and warning that the HOA would be conducting a compliance inspection the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. I called Marcus. They're not backing down, I told him. Neither are you, I assume. Not even slightly. Good. Here's what you do. On Tuesday morning, you be home. When they show up, you politely but firmly deny them entry to your property. Record everything. If they push, call the police and report trespassing. That seems extreme. Zach, they're trying to intimidate you into submission. You need to establish boundaries. They have no legal right to inspect your property without your consent or a court order. Make them understand that. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. I made coffee and waited. At exactly 10 a.m., 2 vehicles pulled up. Margaret Norton's Mercedes and a silver Lexus sedan. 4 people got out. Margaret, Brenda, and 2 men I didn't recognize. I met them at the end of my driveway, phone in hand, recording. Good morning, I said pleasantly. Mr. Owens, we're here for the scheduled inspection, Margaret announced. There's no scheduled inspection. I didn't agree to any inspection. The notice was placed on your door. A notice I didn't agree to. This is private property. You're not entering without my permission. One of the men stepped forward. He was in his 60s, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Owens, I'm Donald Price, HOA Vice President. We're simply trying to document the violations so we can work with you to resolve them. There are no violations to document. I've reviewed the CC and RS extensively. Everything on my property is compliant. That's not for you to decide, Brenda snapped. Actually, it is, until you provide a court order saying otherwise. Margaret's face was turning red. Mr. Owens, if you continue to obstruct our legitimate authority, we will have no choice but to pursue maximum penalties. Mrs. Norton, you have no authority to enter my property. If you attempt to do so, I'll call the police and report trespassing. Is that clear enough? The 4 of them stood there, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. The second man, younger, maybe early 40s with a golf tan, spoke up. This is ridiculous. We're trying to maintain property values for everyone. By harassing homeowners with made-up rules, that's not maintaining values, that's abusing authority. We're not making up anything, Margaret practically shouted. Then show me the documentation. Show me where these rules were properly adopted according to the CC and RS. Show me the homeowner votes. Show me the proper notifications. Silence. That's what I thought. Now, unless you have actual business, I'd like you to leave my property. They left, but not before Margaret promised that I'd be hearing from their attorney. I sent the video recording to Marcus. His response was immediate. Perfect. They just established a pattern of harassment. Keep every piece of evidence. Life settled into an uneasy routine for the next week. I continued my normal activities, maintaining my property to reasonable standards while waiting for the next shoe to drop. It dropped on a Friday afternoon when I found a notice in my mailbox from the Yavapai County Superior Court. The HOA was filing for an injunction to force me to comply with their rules and pay the accumulated fines, which had now grown to $3,000 with added late fees and legal costs. I called Marcus immediately. They actually filed. Interesting. What do we do? We respond and we counterclaim. They've just made this official, which means discovery. We get to demand all their documents, all their meeting minutes, all their financial records, everything. And Zach, I think it's time to turn up the pressure on your end. What do you mean? Those utilities. You've been patient and reasonable. Maybe it's time to remind the HOA that you hold some cards too. I'm not cutting people's power, Marcus. I'm not suggesting that, but you can absolutely request an audit of the infrastructure on your property. You can demand proof of proper insurance and maintenance. You can exercise your property rights in ways that are completely legal but extremely inconvenient for them. I thought about it. Walk me through it. Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a strategy. I would formally request documentation from the HOA regarding the infrastructure on my property. Maintenance records, insurance certificates, proof they had authority to access my land beyond the basic utility easements. I would also inform the utility companies that I was reviewing all arrangements regarding my property and would be conducting inspections of the equipment. All perfectly legal. All extremely annoying for an HOA that was used to operating without oversight. The goal, Marcus explained, is to make them realize that continuing to harass you is far more trouble than it's worth. You're not being aggressive. You're simply exercising your rights as a property owner. I spent the weekend drafting letters. On Monday, they went out to the HOA, the water company, the electric utility, and the gas company. Each one was polite but firm, requesting comprehensive documentation and notification of my intent to conduct inspections. The water company responded first. A technician called me Tuesday morning. "Mr. Owens, this is Jerry Paulson from Prescott Valley Water. I got your letter about the junction on your property." "Yes, what can I help you with?" "Well, sir, that junction isn't actually our equipment. It's privately owned. We just maintain the connection to our main line. You'd need to talk to whoever owns it." "And who owns it?" "According to our records, it was built by the original developer. I assume it's HOA property now, but you'd have to confirm with them." "Interesting. So if something happened to that junction, the water to Sunset Ridge Estates would be affected?" "Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the only feed into the neighborhood. If that junction went down, all 63 homes would lose water service until it was repaired." "Good to know. Thanks, Jerry." The electric company had a similar response. The transformer was theirs, but it sat on my property, and any issues with access or maintenance would require working with me as the property owner. The gas company confirmed that while their main line ran through an easement, the pressure regulator was privately owned HOA infrastructure. Every utility basically confirmed what I'd already discovered. The HOA's neighborhood infrastructure was dependent on equipment that sat on my property, equipment I had rights regarding as the landowner. Wednesday afternoon, I received a furious call from Margaret Norton. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded without preamble. "Exercising my property rights. You're harassing the utilities. You're disrupting essential services. I'm requesting documentation regarding infrastructure on my property. That's not harassment, Mrs. Norton. That's due diligence. This is retaliation for the lawsuit. This is a property owner understanding what's on his land and ensuring it's properly maintained and insured. Speaking of which, I haven't received the documentation I requested. Maintenance records, insurance certificates, proof of authority to access my property. We don't need your permission to access utility equipment. Actually, beyond the specific utility easements for the companies themselves, yes, you do. That equipment is on my private property. I need to verify it's properly maintained and insured. If something fails and causes damage to my land, I need to know who's liable. You're going to regret this, Mr. Owens." "Is that a threat, Mrs. Norton?" "Because I'm recording this call." She hung up. That evening, I got a different kind of visitor. A man in his 70s, walking with a slight limp, knocked on my door. He had kind eyes and a weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors. "Mr. Owens, I'm Robert Chen. I live 3 houses down. Do you have a moment?" "Sure, come in." Over coffee, Robert explained that he'd lived in Sunset Ridge for 15 years. "I want you to know, not everyone supports what Margaret and her board are doing. A lot of us think they've gone way too far. Why doesn't anyone stop them?" "Fear, mostly. She's placed liens on properties before. She's made life hell for people who crossed her. Most folks just want to live quietly. How did she get so much power? Apathy. For years, nobody cared about the HOA. Then, Margaret moved in about 5 years ago, ran for the board, and started recruiting her friends. Before we knew it, she controlled everything. She got the CC and RS amended, or at least she claims she did, and started enforcing all these new rules. There's no record of proper amendments. I know, some of us have questioned it, but she always has some explanation, some procedural justification, and her lawyer backs her up. "Robert, I'm not backing down on this," he smiled. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that. Look, I'm retired Navy 30 years. I recognize a fellow veteran when I see one. Margaret picked the wrong person to bully this time. I appreciate the support. More than support. There are at least 20 homeowners who'd vote to remove the current board if we could organize it, but we need someone willing to lead that effort, someone she can't intimidate." I thought about it. Let me deal with the current legal situation first. But yeah, I'm interested. Robert left me with his contact information and a list of other homeowners who were fed up with Margaret's reign. The next few weeks were a flurry of legal activity. Marcus filed our response to the HOA's injunction along with a comprehensive counterclaim alleging harassment, enforcement of non-existent rules, and violation of proper HOA governance procedures. We also demanded extensive discovery. The HOA's lawyer, Stevens, tried to fight the discovery requests, but the judge sided with us. The HOA was ordered to produce all documentation related to rule changes, board meetings, and financial records for the past 5 years. While that was happening, I continued my own documentation requests. The HOA had still not provided maintenance records or insurance certificates for the equipment on my property. I sent a second formal request, this time noting the days that had elapsed since my first request. I also hired a structural engineer to inspect the utility junction and transformer on my property. His report was enlightening. The water junction, while functional, showed signs of deferred maintenance. Several seals were degraded, and the access panel lock was rusted. The electrical transformer area was overgrown with vegetation, potentially creating a fire hazard. I sent copies of the engineer's report to the HOA and the relevant utility companies, along with a notice that I expected these issues to be addressed within 30 days. Margaret's response was to increase my fines to $5,000. Marcus laughed when I told him. "She's panicking. She knows the court case isn't going well, so she's trying to intimidate you with bigger numbers. Is it working? You tell me. Not even slightly." That's what I figured. All right, here's where we are. Discovery is producing some very interesting documents. It looks like Margaret and her board have been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom. There are unexplained expenses, meetings with no minutes, rules that appear to have been invented without any homeowner input. Is that criminal? Potentially. At minimum, it's breach of fiduciary duty. I've also found evidence that they've been selective in enforcement. Properties owned by board members or their friends have violations that were never cited, while others, like yours, get hit with everything. So what's our next move? We push for a quick trial date. The longer this drags out, the more it costs everyone. But I think when the judge sees what we've uncovered, this is going to resolve fast. The trial was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I continued living my life, maintaining my property, and documenting every interaction with the HOA. I also started meeting with Robert and his group of frustrated homeowners. There were 23 of them, nearly 40% of the neighborhood. All had stories of arbitrary fines, harassment, and rules that appeared out of nowhere. She fined me $500 because my Christmas lights were still up in January, one woman, Linda, told me. I'd had surgery and couldn't take them down yet. When I explained that, she added another $200 for being argumentative. She made me rip out my vegetable garden, another homeowner, Tom, shared. Said it was unsightly. It was in my backyard. You couldn't even see it from the street. The stories went on. Margaret and her board had created an atmosphere of fear and compliance, extracting fines for increasingly trivial or fabricated violations. The thing is, Robert explained, most of the original CC and Rs were pretty reasonable. Basic stuff about not letting your property turn into a junkyard, not running a commercial business out of your garage, that kind of thing. But Margaret has added all these rules about grass height, Approved paint colors, what you can plant, what kind of vehicles you can park in your driveway. None of it was ever properly voted on. We need to document all of this, I said. Every violation, every fine, every arbitrary enforcement decision. It'll support the case that this isn't legitimate governance, it's harassment. Over the next month, we compiled a database. 23 homeowners, over 100 violations, more than $50,000 in fines, and not a single piece of documentation showing proper rule adoption procedures. Marcus was ecstatic when I showed him. This is gold, Zach. This shows a pattern and practice of abuse. The judge is going to eviscerate them. But Margaret wasn't done fighting. 2 weeks before trial, I received another visit. This time, it was Donald Price, the vice president, alone. "Mr. Owens, may I speak with you?" I let him in, curious. Donald looked uncomfortable. "I'm here unofficially. Margaret doesn't know I'm talking to you." "I'm listening." "She's going to propose a settlement. Drop all the fines, leave you alone if you drop the counterclaim and discovery requests." "Why would I do that?" "Because the alternative is that this goes to trial and everything comes out. Everything about how the HOA has been run, the finances, all of it. And Mr. Owens, there are things in those records that are going to cause serious problems for people." "Illegal things?" Donald hesitated. "Questionable things, money that was spent without proper authorization, contracts awarded to companies owned by board members' relatives, that kind of thing." "Sounds like exactly the kind of thing that should come out." "Mr. Owens, I'm not defending what's happened. I'm just trying to prevent a situation where everyone loses. If this goes public, property values in Sunset Ridge will tank. Everyone's investment suffers. Donald, I appreciate you coming here. But no. This needs to see daylight. What Margaret and the board have done isn't just wrong, it's potentially criminal. Covering it up helps no one except the people who did it." He nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. For what it's worth, I'm resigning from the board effective tomorrow. I don't want to be part of this anymore." "That's probably wise." After Donald left, I called Marcus and told him about the settlement offer. "They're scared," he said. "Good. Don't take it. We're too close to exposing everything." The week before trial, things escalated in a way I didn't expect. I woke up one morning to find my water wasn't working. I checked the main valve, checked for leaks. Everything seemed fine from my end. I called the water company. "Mr. Owens, our records show your service is active. The problem must be on the private side, probably that junction on your property." I walked out to the utility building in my backyard. The access door was standing open, and someone had shut off the main valve that fed into my house, the valve that also fed the entire neighborhood. I turned it back on, and my water returned. But this was deliberate. Someone had come onto my property and tampered with the utilities. I called the sheriff's department and filed a report. Then, I installed security cameras covering the utility building. 2 days later, the cameras caught Margaret Norton and another woman I recognized as Brenda entering my property at 7 in the morning and approaching the utility building. I called the sheriff's department again. This time, they took it seriously. A deputy came out, reviewed the footage, and went to speak with Margaret. She denied everything, claimed she was simply checking on infrastructure the HOA was responsible for maintaining. The deputy informed her that she was trespassing and that any further entry onto my property without permission would result in arrest. Marcus filed an emergency motion with the court, presenting the video evidence and requesting a restraining order. The judge granted it. Margaret Norton and any HOA representatives were prohibited from coming within 100 feet of my property except on public streets. The trial began on a Tuesday in late March. The courtroom was small, just Judge Patricia Reeves presiding, no jury for this type of civil matter. Marcus and I sat on one side. The HOA's table had Margaret Norton, Brenda, and one remaining board member, plus their attorney Stevens. Marcus presented our case methodically, the original CC and RS, showing what rules actually existed. Documentation requests showing the HOA had no proof of properly amending those rules. Evidence of selective enforcement with properties owned by board members' friends showing no violations while others were heavily fined. Financial records showing questionable expenditures and contracts, and the security footage showing Margaret trespassing on my property to tamper with utilities. Stevens tried to defend it, arguing that the HOA had broad authority to maintain community standards and that the board had acted in good faith. But when Judge Reeves started asking specific questions about documentation, about meeting minutes, about homeowner votes on rule changes, he had no answers. The judge called for a recess and returned an hour later with her decision. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented," Judge Reeves began. "This is one of the more troubling HOA cases I've encountered. The defendants have systematically failed to follow their own governing documents, enforced rules that were never properly adopted, and engaged in what can only be described as harassment of homeowners who questioned their authority." She looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Norton, your conduct has been particularly egregious. Trespassing on Mr. Owens's property, tampering with utilities, retaliating against him for exercising his legal rights, this is unacceptable. The judge ruled in our favor on every count. All fines against me were dismissed. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement actions based on rules not properly adopted according to the original CC and RS. They were ordered to pay my legal fees, which had reached nearly $15,000. But Judge Reeves went further. I'm also ordering a forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years to be conducted by an independent auditor at the HOA's expense. Based on the evidence presented regarding questionable expenditures, I want a full accounting of how homeowner dues were spent." Margaret's face went pale. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm referring the findings of this case to the Attorney General's office for review regarding potential criminal charges related to misuse of HOA funds." The trial ended, and we walked out victorious. But I knew this wasn't over. The forensic audit would take months, and depending on what it found, there could be criminal proceedings. In the parking lot, Robert was waiting with several other homeowners who'd come to watch the proceedings. "You did it," he said, shaking my hand. "We're not done yet. The audit is going to take time. But we can move forward with removing the board?" "Absolutely. Under the CC and RS, any homeowner can call for a special election with signatures from 25% of owners. You've got way more than that." Over the next week, we organized. Robert collected signatures, and we submitted a formal petition for a special election to remove the current board members and elect new ones. Under Arizona law and the HOA's own bylaws, the election had to occur within 60 days. Margaret tried to fight it, claiming the petition was invalid, but she had no standing anymore. Her lawyer had dropped her as a client after the trial, unwilling to continue representing her in what was clearly a losing battle. The special election was scheduled for late May. Meanwhile, the forensic audit was underway. The auditor, a thorough woman named Patricia Mills, started requesting documents and conducting interviews. I heard through Robert that Margaret was furious, but had no choice but to comply under court order. In early May, Patricia called me. "Mr. Owens, I'm not supposed to discuss my findings before the final report, but I felt you should know. The level of financial irregularity I'm uncovering is significant. There are over $100,000 in questionable expenditures over the past 4 years." "What kind of expenditures?" "Landscaping contracts awarded to a company owned by Mrs. Norton's brother-in-law at rates significantly above market value. Legal fees for cases that never existed. Repairs to common areas that were never actually performed. It's extensive." "Is it criminal?" "That's for the Attorney General to determine, but in my professional opinion, yes. This appears to be systematic embezzlement and fraud." The final audit report was delivered to the court in mid-May. It detailed over $130,000 in misappropriated HOA funds. Margaret Norton had used her position to funnel money to family members and friends through inflated contracts. She'd paid herself consulting fees that weren't authorized. She'd used HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as community costs. The Attorney General's office moved quickly. On May 20th, Margaret Norton was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and theft. Brenda, who had been the HOA treasurer and signed off on many of the questionable expenditures, was also charged. The special election happened on schedule. Robert ran for president, along with a slate of reform candidates. They won overwhelmingly. The new board's first action was to rescind all the unauthorized rules Margaret had implemented and return the HOA to its original, simple CC and RS. Their second action was to formally apologize to all homeowners who had been harassed and agree to refund any fines collected under the invalid rules. I attended the first meeting of the new board in June. It was a different atmosphere entirely. Robert ran it efficiently but fairly, focusing on actual community needs like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events. After the meeting, Robert pulled me aside. "I still can't believe it came to this. I knew Margaret was difficult, but I never imagined she was stealing from us." "Power corrupts," I said, "especially small power over small domains. She thought she was untouchable. Well, thanks to you, she learned otherwise. Have you heard the latest?" "What?" "She's trying to claim she was just following standard HOA practices. Her lawyer's arguing that lots of HOAs operate this way." "That's not a defense. That's an indictment of HOA governance in general," Robert laughed. The prosecutor apparently said something similar. Margaret Norton's trial began in August. I was called to testify about the harassment, the fines, the trespassing incident. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Lisa Martinez, built a methodical case showing how Margaret had systematically abused her position for personal gain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came in September. Margaret Norton was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to repay the full amount embezzled plus interest. Brenda received 2 years and was ordered to repay her portion of the stolen funds. I sat in the courtroom and watched as Margaret was led away in handcuffs, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd destroyed her life over what amounted to, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small amount of money and a petty desire for control. But mostly I felt relieved. The neighborhood could finally move forward. Life in Sunset Ridge Estates settled into something approaching normal over the following months. The new board focused on actual community improvement. They organized neighborhood barbecues, established a reasonable schedule for common area maintenance, and most importantly, left homeowners alone to live their lives. Robert and I became good friends. We'd grab coffee sometimes and talk about our service years, about the absurdity of what had transpired with Margaret, about life in general. "You know what's funny?" Robert said one morning in November as we sat on my back porch. "You moved here looking for peace and quiet after the Army. And instead, I got an HOA war. But you won, and you freed the rest of us in the process." I looked out over my property, at the utility building that had been the key to everything. I almost bought a place outside of town with no HOA. The realtor talked me into this neighborhood, said it was well maintained with minimal restrictions. Minimal restrictions? That's rich. You know what the ironic thing is? I never actually threatened to cut off the utilities. I just wanted documentation and respect for property rights. But the fact that you could have was what terrified them. Margaret operated on fear and intimidation. When she met someone she couldn't intimidate, someone who had actual leverage, her whole system collapsed. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching hawks circle in the distance. "So what now?" Robert asked. "You planning to stay?" "Yeah, I think so. The neighborhood's pretty nice now that it's not being run by a wannabe dictator." "Well, we're glad to have you, even if you did turn our quiet little HOA into a federal case." I laughed. "I was just defending my property. They're the ones who made it complicated." Looking back now, months after everything settled, I still find the whole situation surreal. I retired from the Army expecting to fade into quiet civilian life, maybe do some consulting work, enjoy my property. Instead, I ended up in a legal battle that exposed corruption, led to criminal convictions, and completely reformed how an entire neighborhood was governed. All because I refused to pay a fine for grass that was already within regulations. The utilities angle, my control over the infrastructure feeding the neighborhood, had been the leverage I needed but never actually used. Just knowing I could audit, inspect, and exercise my property rights regarding that equipment had been enough. It forced the HOA to take me seriously when they were used to steamrolling anyone who questioned them. I learned something important through all of this. Most bullies, whether they're in a war zone or running a homeowner association, operate on the assumption that people won't fight back. They rely on apathy, fear, and ignorance. But when someone stands up, does their research, understands their rights, and refuses to be intimidated, the whole structure often collapses remarkably quickly. Margaret Norton had built her little empire on the assumption that homeowners wouldn't question her authority. When I did, and when I had the knowledge and resources to back up that questioning, everything unraveled. The utilities were just one aspect. The real power came from understanding the law, documenting everything, and being willing to see it through to the end. Would I do it again? In a heartbeat. Property rights matter. The rule of law matters. And when someone abuses authority, whether they're running a country or a homeowner association, they need to be held accountable. These days, the most dramatic thing that happens in Sunset Ridge Estates is the annual 4th of July barbecue, which Robert organizes with military precision. The HOA has a modest budget that's used for exactly what it should be, maintaining common areas and organizing community events. The dues are reasonable, the rules are clear and actually exist in the CC and RS, and nobody gets fined for having grass that's 3 inches instead of 2. I still own the property with all those utilities running through it. The new HOA board properly ensured the infrastructure and established a real maintenance schedule. We have a formal agreement now, documented in legal, that clarifies everyone's rights and responsibilities. They maintain the equipment, I allow access for maintenance, and everyone treats each other with respect. It's amazing how well things work when people follow the rules and act in good faith. Sometimes I walk out to that utility building and think about how such a small piece of infrastructure became the key to toppling a corrupt HOA board. The water junction is painted now, properly maintained with new seals and a functioning lock. The area around the electrical transformer is cleared of vegetation and safely accessible. Everything is as it should be. And my grass? I keep it at 3 inches, right in the middle of the acceptable range. Not because anyone's watching or because I'm worried about fines, but because it looks nice and it's the right height for the climate here. That's what HOAs should be about. Helping maintain a community through reasonable standards that everyone agrees to, not extracting fines for made-up violations or enriching board members through corrupt contracts. I got a letter last month from one of Margaret's victims, an elderly veteran named Frank who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. He'd been fined repeatedly for having his American flag displayed wrong, even though it was displayed exactly according to flag code. He'd paid over $2,000 in fines over 3 years, money he could barely afford on his fixed income. The new board refunded every penny, plus interest. Frank's letter thanked me for standing up to Margaret when others couldn't or wouldn't. He said it restored his faith that doing the right thing still matters, that bullies don't always win. I keep that letter in my desk drawer and read it sometimes when I'm feeling cynical about the world. Because here's the truth I learned from this whole experience. The systems we create to govern ourselves, whether it's an HOA or a city council or a nation, are only as good as the people running them and the willingness of everyone else to hold those people accountable. Margaret Norton was able to operate her corrupt little fiefdom for years because people were afraid to challenge her. It took someone with nothing to lose, someone who'd faced actual danger and wasn't impressed by threats of fines and liens, to call her bluff. And once one person stood up, others found the courage to stand up too. That's how change happens, how corruption gets exposed, how justice eventually prevails, not through some grand dramatic gesture, but through ordinary people deciding they have had enough and being willing to do the hard work of fighting back through legal, proper channels. I'm proud of what we accomplished here in Sunset Ridge Estates. We removed a corrupt board, recovered stolen money, sent criminals to prison, and reformed our community governance. We did it by following the law, documenting everything, and refusing to be intimidated. And yeah, the fact that I happened to own the property that controlled access to every utility feeding the neighborhood probably helped. But I never had to cut anyone's water or power. The threat was enough, the knowledge that they couldn't just bully me without consequences. Sometimes the best weapon is the one you never have to use. I'm sitting on my porch now as I think about all this, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple. My truck is parked in the driveway, visible from the street and completely allowed. My satellite dish is on my roof, properly installed and functioning perfectly. My grass is 3 inches tall, healthy and green from this morning's watering. And I'm at peace, finally, in the quiet retirement I was looking for when I moved here. It just took dismantling a corrupt HOA, exposing financial crimes, and winning a court case to get here. But you know what? It was worth it. Every single moment was worth it. Because now, when I look around this neighborhood, I see a community instead of a dictatorship. I see neighbors who wave and smile instead of looking nervously over their shoulders. I see a HOA that serves its members instead of exploiting them. And that's something worth fighting for, whether you're in a combat zone or a quiet Arizona subdivision. The utilities still run through my property, water and power and gas and internet flowing to 63 homes. But now it's just infrastructure, properly maintained and documented, not a weapon or a threat or leverage in some petty power game. Just pipes and wires doing what they're supposed to do, serving a community. And me, I'm just a retired Army engineer who wanted to be left alone and ended up reforming an HOA instead. Life's funny that way sometimes.